Picture this, September 8th, 1900, Galveston, Texas. Your barometer reads 28.48 inches and falling fast, the lowest pressure ever recorded on the Gulf Coast. And this wasn't just another tropical storm rolling in from the Caribbean. This was the beginning of 12 hours that would erase an entire city from the map and claim more American lives than any natural disaster before or since. The Great Galveston Hurricane. 8,000 souls lost in a single night. For those who survived, the memory wasn't just of the wind or the waves. It was of watching their city dissolve into the sea, of clinging to floating debris while their neighbors drowned beside them, and of discovering on Sunday morning that the world they knew had simply ceased to exist. America was a different place in 1900. William McKinley was in the White House. The Wright brothers hadn't yet flown at Kitty Hawk. The automobile was a curious novelty. Galveston was the jewel of Texas, the wealthiest city per capita in the entire United States. Its deep water port made it the gateway to the Southwest. Cotton flowed through its docks by the millions of bales. Grand Victorian mansions lined Broadway. Electric streetcars hummed down the avenues. Theaters, opera houses, banks, and hotels that rivaled anything in New Orleans or Charleston. Back then, you didn't have satellite images or computer models. You had the Weather Bureau, a handful of men with barometers and thermometers sending telegrams to Washington. You had yesterday's newspaper and the fisherman's wisdom about the sky. That was your warning system. And on Friday, September 7th, 1900, the warnings were confused, contradictory, and ultimately meaningless. It was a Friday evening, and people across Galveston were settling in for the weekend. Families gathered around dinner tables laden with fresh Gulf shrimp and oysters. Businessmen loosened their collars in the humid heat. Children played in the streets, their laughter mixing with the sound of horses' hooves on brick pavement. The temperature hovered around 86 degrees. Warm, yes, but this was the Texas coast in early September. Heat was expected. The forecast mentioned a tropical storm, somewhere out in the Gulf. Of course it did. Storms in September were as common as mosquitoes. The Weather Bureau's official position was that the storm would curve northward, miss Galveston entirely, and make landfall somewhere up near Louisiana. Nothing to worry about. Nothing that would stop commerce from moving forward. Nothing that would cancel Saturday's plans. So people went to bed. They pulled back their cotton sheets in the oppressive heat. They opened their windows to catch whatever breeze might drift in from the Gulf. They made plans for Saturday, shopping, visiting, perhaps a trip to the beach to watch the unusually high surf. They had no idea what was already forming in the darkness beyond the barrier island. Here's something most people don't realize about weather forecasting in 1900. There was no way to see what was happening over the open ocean. Out in the Gulf of Mexico, a massive hurricane was intensifying with a speed that nobody could measure because nobody knew it was there. A system that had formed near Cuba, that had torn through the Caribbean, was now moving directly toward Galveston with winds that would later be estimated at 145 miles per hour. And there was something else, something that made Galveston uniquely vulnerable. The entire island sat less than 9 feet above sea level at its highest point. Most of the city was barely 5 feet up. There was no seawall, no protection, nothing between 37,000 people and the open Gulf of Mexico. City leaders had been warned for years. Engineers had proposed a seawall. Each time the city council rejected it. Too expensive, unnecessary. Galveston had weathered storms before. Around midnight on Friday, the wind began picking up. Most people were asleep and didn't notice. The barometric pressure was dropping faster than anyone had ever seen. By 3 o'clock in the morning on Saturday, September 8th, the Gulf was angry. Waves were already running higher than normal, crashing against the beach with unusual force. Isaac Klein was 38 years old, the head of the Galveston Weather Bureau station. He'd spent 17 years studying storms, tracking patterns, issuing forecasts. He lived on the beach with his pregnant wife Cora and their 3 young daughters. When his instruments started showing him numbers he didn't believe, he thought they were broken. By 5 o'clock in the morning, he knew better. The barometer was plummeting. The wind was screaming in from the north, the wrong direction for a normal storm, and the water was rising. Not slowly, not gradually. Fast, too fast. By 6 o'clock in the morning, the tide was 5 feet above normal and still climbing. Isaac hitched up his horse and buggy and drove up and down the beach, pounding on doors, shouting warnings. Get off the beach, get to higher ground, the storm surge is coming. Some people listened, most didn't. Where was higher ground? The whole island was flat, and besides, it was Saturday, people had errands to run. Children wanted to go watch the waves. Teenagers saw adventure, not danger. By 8 o'clock in the morning, crowds had gathered along the beach to watch the spectacular surf. 20-foot waves rolling in, crashing over the bathhouses, flooding the beachfront streets. It was magnificent. It was terrifying. It was unlike anything Galveston had ever seen. And still, most people didn't understand. Not yet. By 9 o'clock in the morning, the wind was howling at 50 miles per hour. Rain began falling, not in drops, but in sheets horizontal, driven by wind so strong it stung exposed skin. The temperature dropped from 86 degrees to 72 in less than an hour, and the water kept rising, flooding the first floors of beach houses, lifting buildings off their foundations, pushing inland, block by block, unstoppable. At 10 o'clock in the morning, Isaac Klein tried to send a telegram to the Weather Bureau headquarters in Washington. Unusually heavy swells from the southeast. Overflowing low places, winds increasing. The telegraph lines went dead before he could finish. Galveston was cut off. No communication in, no communication out. The island was alone with the storm. By noon, the storm surge had covered most of the city. Water 4 feet deep in the streets downtown, 6 feet deep in the residential areas, 8 feet deep near the beach. And it wasn't just water, it was debris. Pieces of buildings, lumber, furniture, dead animals, everything the surge had torn loose, all of it swirling in a violent current that knocked people off their feet and dragged them away. The wind reached 100 miles per hour, buildings began to collapse. Not the wooden frame houses, those were already gone, lifted off their foundations and smashed to kindling. The brick buildings, the substantial structures that people thought were safe. The weight of the water, the force of the wind, the battering from debris, it was too much. Walls crumbled, roofs flew away, windows exploded inward. Mary Austin was 24 years old, a school teacher who lived in a boarding house on Avenue M. When the water started coming into the first floor that morning, she and the other residents climbed to the second floor. When the water followed them up the stairs, they climbed into the attic. 23 people crowded into that dark space, listening to the wind tear at the roof above them, feeling the building shudder with each gust. Then the building next door collapsed. The debris slammed into their boarding house like a battering ram. The entire structure shifted. Mary heard timber snapping, heard people screaming, and then the attic floor gave way beneath her feet. She fell into the churning water below, boards and beams crashing down around her. She grabbed onto a piece of floating timber and held on. For hours she held on while the storm raged around her, while bodies floated past, while the city she knew disintegrated into the flood. Dr. Samuel Young was 52 years old, a physician with a practice downtown. When he realized the storm was worse than anyone had predicted, he tried to reach his family's home on the West End. The water was already waist-deep in the streets. He waded through it, fighting the current, dodging debris. Halfway there, he watched a house lift off its foundation and crash into another building. Both structures exploded into pieces. He saw people in the windows just before the collision. After, he saw nothing but wreckage. He never made it home. He took shelter in a brick bank building with 30 other people. They climbed to the second floor, then the third as the water chased them upward. For 12 hours, they listened to the storm destroy their city. The wind so loud they couldn't hear each other scream. The building shaking so violently they were certain every gust would be the one that brought it down. When morning finally came, Dr. Young would discover that his wife, his 2 children, and his mother-in-law were all dead. Their house was gone. Just a bare foundation and a pile of twisted lumber. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the storm surge had reached its peak, 15 feet of water above normal sea level. Think about that. 15 feet, covering an entire city. Every building on the island was underwater, every street, every home, every business. Galveston had become an ocean. The wind reached its maximum intensity around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, 145 miles per hour, sustained. Gusts well over 150. At those speeds, wind doesn't just blow, it destroys everything it touches. Wooden structures simply disintegrated, brick buildings lost their walls, church steeples toppled, bridges collapsed, ships in the harbor, massive ocean-going vessels, were torn from their moorings and hurled inland, crashing through buildings like cannonballs. Along the beach, where the finest homes in Galveston had stood that morning, there was now nothing. Just water and debris, 3,000 buildings gone in the first few hours, 6,000 more damaged beyond recognition. Entire neighborhoods simply ceased to exist. In the chaos, families were torn apart, parents lost children in the flood. Husbands and wives were separated in the darkness. People clung to whatever they could find, floating on rooftops, on pieces of buildings, on doors and tables and anything that would keep them above the water. They drifted through a nightmare landscape of destruction, hearing calls from the darkness, unable to help, unable to see, just holding on and praying for dawn. The Ursuline convent stood on the corner of Avenue M and 21st Street, a substantial three-story building that housed 10 nuns and 93 orphan children. When the storm surge reached the convent around 2 o'clock that afternoon, the nuns gathered all the children on the third floor. They tied the smallest children to themselves with rope, groups of 6 or 8 children secured to each nun. They prayed, they sang hymns to keep the children calm, and they waited. At 5 o'clock in the evening, the building collapsed. The walls gave way, the roof caved in, the entire structure fell into the flood. Only 3 boys survived. They were found the next morning clinging to a piece of timber. The nuns and children who'd sheltered there were lost to the storm. For weeks afterward, rescuers worked through the wreckage. The loss of life in Galveston on September 8, 1900 was unprecedented. 8,000 souls. More Americans than were lost in the Johnstown flood, more than the Chicago fire, more than the San Francisco earthquake, more than any single battle of the Civil War. The deadliest natural disaster in American history happened in one city, on one island, in one terrible day. But here's what nobody tells you about the Galveston hurricane. It wasn't just about the numbers. It was about what happened after the water receded. Sunday morning, September 9th, 1900. The storm had passed during the night, the wind had died, the water had drained back into the Gulf, pulling with it debris and the wreckage of an entire city. The survivors, perhaps 30,000 people, emerged from whatever shelter they'd found and saw what was left. Nothing. There was nothing left. Where buildings had stood, there were empty lots covered in splinters. Where streets had run, there were fields of debris 10 feet deep. Where neighborhoods had thrived, there was silence. The only sounds were survivors calling for family members and the cawing of seabirds circling overhead. Isaac Klein walked through the ruins of the city he had tried to warn. His house was gone. His pregnant wife Cora had been lost to the flood. His 3 daughters had survived only because they'd managed to grab onto debris. He found them Sunday morning, alive but traumatized, clinging to a pile of lumber a mile from where their house had been. For the rest of his life, Isaac would wonder if he could have done more, said more, warned more loudly. The answer, of course, was no. But survivors always wonder. The city faced an impossible situation. The September heat was brutal. Disease threatened the living. Cholera, typhoid, plague, all were possible. The scope of the tragedy made traditional responses impossible. Something had to be done immediately. Work crews went through the ruins systematically. They organized recovery efforts block by block. They worked in the heat, in conditions that would haunt many of them for years. The smell carried across the entire island. Survivors later described the cleanup as the worst part, worse than the storm itself. Knowing what they were recovering, knowing these were neighbors, friends, families, the official count settled at 8,000, but many historians believe the true number was higher, perhaps 10,000, perhaps more. Nobody knows. Entire families were lost together, leaving no one to report them missing. Neighborhoods vanished completely, with no survivors to remember who had lived there. But while Galveston was burning its dead, the living were already starting to rebuild. And here's where something unexpected happened. The disaster revealed something about human nature that no newspaper report could have predicted. On Sunday afternoon, while people were still searching for survivors, someone opened a bakery. How they managed it, how they found flour and yeast and wood for the ovens, nobody knows. But they baked bread, and they gave it away to anyone who needed it. The line stretched 3 blocks. A saloon owner, a man named Ritter, somehow got his establishment running again on Monday, but he didn't sell liquor. He gave away clean water and coffee. His bar became a gathering place, a place where people could find each other, share information, and simply be together. Teenage boys formed work crews. They weren't asked, they weren't organized by any authority, they just showed up with shovels and started clearing streets. 14 and 15-year-old kids, working 12-hour days in the heat, moving debris, searching for survivors, doing whatever needed doing. Women set up makeshift kitchens in the ruins. They pooled whatever food they could find, shared their supplies, and cooked communal meals for neighborhoods. There was no discussion about who deserved help. If you were there, you ate. The Galveston Business Association organized immediately. By Monday, they had crews working to restore telegraph lines to the mainland. By Tuesday, the first messages were getting through. By Wednesday, relief supplies were arriving by boat. Food, water, tents, medical supplies, everything Galveston needed to survive. Clara Barton, founder of the American Red Cross, was 78 years old. When news of the hurricane reached Washington, she immediately arranged to travel to Galveston. She arrived on September 17th, 9 days after the storm, and brought with her the first organized relief effort. Money, supplies, medical personnel, and something just as important, official recognition that what had happened in Galveston mattered to the rest of the country. The response from across America was overwhelming. Chicago sent $125,000, New York sent $100,000, cities across the nation organized benefits and fundraisers, school children donated their pennies. Within weeks, over $1.2 million had poured in, the equivalent of tens of millions today. It wasn't enough to replace what had been lost, but it was enough to start over. And Galveston did start over, but not by pretending the hurricane hadn't happened. The survivors made a decision. They would stay, they would rebuild, but they would do it differently. For children, the hurricane was something that would define the rest of their lives. An 11-year-old girl named Louise Hopkins remembered decades later that Sunday morning felt like walking through a dream. Everything familiar was gone. The streets she'd walked to school, the homes where her friends had lived, the park where she'd played, all vanished. She spent that day helping her father search for her grandparents. They found their house, or what was left of it. Her grandparents were inside, drowned. Louise was the one who spotted her grandmother's dress in the wreckage. She was 11 years old. A boy named Arnold Wolfram was 8. His family survived by climbing onto their roof as the house was lifted off its foundation. They floated on that roof for hours, spinning in the flood, crashing into other debris. Arnold remembered looking down into the water and seeing fish, hundreds of fish, swimming through what used to be his living room. He remembered thinking it was the strangest thing he'd ever seen. Only later, only as an adult, did he realize what he'd been seeing. The Gulf of Mexico had swallowed his city. Schools didn't reopen for 6 weeks. When they did, classes were held in tents because most of the school buildings were destroyed. Teachers took attendance and realized how many children were missing. Entire classrooms had lost half their students. There were no grief counselors in 1900, no trauma therapy. Children were simply expected to move forward, to help their parents rebuild, to be strong. Many of them were. But they carried those memories forever. The sound of wind at night made them wake in terror. The sight of rising water caused panic. Every September, for the rest of their lives, they watched the sky differently. But for adults, the hurricane was different. It was a revelation of how completely life could change in a single day. Wealthy merchants who'd owned successful businesses woke up on Sunday with nothing but the clothes they'd worn through the storm. Families who'd lived in comfortable homes found themselves sleeping in tents on vacant lots. The social structure of Galveston had been erased as completely as the buildings. And something unexpected happened. Class distinctions that had seemed so important on Friday mattered less on Monday. The banker whose home had survived took in the factory worker whose family had died. The society woman who'd never spoken to her servants found herself working beside them to clear debris. Strangers who'd passed each other on the street for years without acknowledgement became partners in survival. The cleanup took months. What do you do with an entire city's worth of debris? The wreckage was piled 10, sometimes 15 feet deep across large sections of Galveston. Work crews attacked it systematically, block by block. They salvaged what could be used, lumber, bricks, metal. They burned what couldn't. They pushed the rest into the Gulf. The economic cost was staggering. $30 million in $1,900, perhaps $900 million today. But that number doesn't capture the real loss. Galveston had been the economic engine of Texas. After the hurricane, Houston would take that role. The deep water port that was being planned for Galveston would be built in Houston instead. The businesses that relocated temporarily to the mainland found they preferred it there and never came back. Galveston would rebuild, yes, but it would never reclaim the position it had held. The city that had been the jewel of Texas would become a smaller, quieter place. Some saw this as tragedy. Others saw it as transformation. But the real legacy of the Galveston hurricane wasn't the death toll or the economic impact, it was what the survivors built to make sure it never happened again. In 1902, construction began on a seawall, not the modest structure that had been proposed before the storm, a massive concrete barrier, 17 feet high, 16 feet thick at the base, designed to break the force of storm surge before it could reach the city. The city leaders who had rejected the seawall proposal in 1899 were gone, drowned, or moved away. The new leaders had lived through the hurricane. They knew what was at stake, but a seawall alone wasn't enough. Galveston sat too low. Even with a wall, the next hurricane would flood the city. So they did something extraordinary. They raised the entire city, every building, every street, every lot. They jacked up buildings on hydraulic lifts and pumped in sand, dredged from the ship channel. Some areas were raised 17 feet. It took 7 years and $2.3 million. It was the largest civil engineering project undertaken in the United States up to that time. People lived in their houses while they were being raised. They built temporary stairs to reach their front doors as the ground around them rose month by month. They watched their city transform, literally lifted out of the flood zone. The seawall was completed in 1904. It extended along 3 miles of beachfront. Over the following decades, it would be extended to 10 miles. And it worked. In 1915, another major hurricane struck Galveston with winds just as strong as 1900. The seawall held. The raised city stayed dry. Only 11 people died, compared to 8,000 15 years earlier. Many who lived through both storms were asked which was worse. The answer was always the same. Once you've lived through 1900, everything else is just weather. The storm changed weather forecasting too. After Galveston, the Weather Bureau established hurricane warning networks across the Gulf Coast, telegraph lines, storm spotter programs, better coordination between stations. The tools that might have saved Galveston were developed because Galveston had been lost. But the real legacy wasn't in the engineering or the policy changes. It was in the memories. Everyone who lived through the hurricane remembered. They remembered the silence of Sunday morning. They remembered the pyres burning on the beach. They remembered finding neighbors in the wreckage. They remembered strangers sharing their last food. They remembered what it felt like to lose everything and have to start over. They remembered the neighbor who showed up with a shovel without being asked, the baker who gave away bread, the teenage boys who worked until they collapsed, the mothers who tied children to themselves with clothesline, knowing it wouldn't be enough but trying anyway, the fathers who built rafts from debris and pushed their families through the flood, the teachers who held school in tents, the doctors who set bones and stitched wounds with whatever they could find. They remembered what it felt like to be truly helpless, and they remembered what it felt like to be truly helped. Ask anyone who was there, they'll tell you it was the worst disaster they ever saw, and in the same breath, they'll tell you about the kindness of strangers, about the community that formed when everything else fell apart, about the way people took care of each other, because that's what disasters do. They strip away the superficial. They reveal what's underneath. And in September 1900, what was underneath Galveston's prosperous exterior was something beautiful. Neighbors who didn't know each other's names learned them during the cleanup. Strangers became friends. A community that had prided itself on commerce and wealth discovered it was stronger when it depended on each other. That memory has faded now. The last survivor of the Galveston hurricane died in the 1990s. Their children who heard the stories firsthand are mostly gone too. Their grandchildren have heard them secondhand. But the story matters. It matters because it reminds us what we're capable of, how much we can endure, how much we can give. It matters because someday another storm will come. Maybe not to Galveston, maybe to some other coast, some other city, but it will come. And when it does, we'll need to remember September 8th, 1900, not for the death toll or the destruction, but for the baker who gave away bread, the boys with shovels, the neighbors who helped without being asked. We'll need to remember that when everything else failed, people didn't. Somewhere in Texas, there's an old photograph hanging on a wall. It shows a young woman standing in front of a pile of wreckage. She's wearing a torn dress. Her hair is matted. Her face is streaked with dirt. But she's smiling. On the back of the photograph, in faded ink, someone wrote, Mary Austin. Sunday, September 9th, 1900, survived. Mary was the school teacher who fell from the attic, who grabbed onto floating timber, who held on through 12 hours of hell. She rebuilt her life in Galveston. She taught school for another 40 years. She married, had children, grew old. When her grandchildren asked about the hurricane, she would tell them about the terror. Yes, about watching the city drown. But she always ended the story the same way. She told them about Monday morning, walking through the ruins with nothing but the clothes she wore. She told them about a stranger, a man she'd never met, who offered her a piece of bread. She told them about sitting on a pile of rubble, eating that bread, and realizing she was going to survive. Not just the hurricane, but everything that came after. That's when I knew, she would tell her grandchildren. That's when I knew we'd make it. Because even when everything else was gone, we still had each other. Mary died in 1962 at the age of 86. She lived in Galveston her entire life, in the city that had tried to kill her, in the city she helped rebuild. When they asked her why she stayed, why she didn't leave after the hurricane, her answer was simple. Because it's home. And you don't abandon home just because it hurt you once. That's the real story of the Galveston hurricane. It wasn't just the wind or the water. It was the way people refused to give up. The way they buried their dead, raised their city, and built a seawall that would protect generations to come. They're the reason Galveston survived. They're the reason it still stands today. Because when the water rises and the wind screams and the world tries to wash everything away, we still have each other. The hurricane of 1900 faded into history. The ruins were cleared, the city was razed, the seawall was built, life returned different but alive. People went back to work, back to school, back to the routines that had been destroyed that September day. But something lingered. For years afterward, whenever storm clouds gathered over the Gulf, people in Galveston looked at the sky differently. They remembered. They stocked up earlier. They checked on their neighbors sooner. They didn't take the ordinary for granted quite as much. And when they gathered at family dinners, when the conversation turned to weather and hurricanes, someone would always bring it up. The details might differ, the specific memories varied, but they all shared the same core truth. We made it through together. That's what the Galveston hurricane left behind. Not just a record death toll, not just a disaster for the history books. A story, a shared memory, a reminder of what ordinary people can do in extraordinary circumstances. The waters of 1900 receded long ago. The people who lived through it are gone, but the seawall still stands. And as long as we keep telling the story, it always will.